Good morning. Today is April 11th, 2024 in McKenna Hall here on the University of Notre Dame campus. My name is Karla Yaritza Maravilla Zaragoza, and I'm an English Ph.D. student here at Notre Dame. And I'm here with poet Heidi Andrea Restrepo Rhodes, 2018 winner of the Andrés Montoya Poetry Prize for her poetry collection, The Inheritance of Haunting. She was also the 2022 winner of the Lorca Latinx Poetry Prize for her chapbook, Ephemeral. My task today is to conduct this interview, which will be archived as part of the Letras Latinas Oral History Project, available for current and future poets and scholars to study and find inspiration. Now, before we get into my nitty-gritty questions that I've stacked up for you today, let's peel back the onion of your origins. I hear you've claimed 4 poetic home grounds: Arizona, California, Ohio, and New York. For the purpose of documentation, tell us where you were born. Where did you grow up? Are there any distinct memories, sounds, tastes, or sensations from your childhood or in the present that you carry close to your heart?
I was born in Phoenix, Arizona, and we moved to California when I was 8 years old. I think some of the most distinct memories are my paternal grandparents helped raise us in Phoenix, and I really am grateful to them for instilling in me a sense of wonder about the world. And I have very vivid memories of my grandmother keeping this chest of little things from nature, like a robin's egg, a bird's nest, like a pine cone, just little things that felt like treasures. And she had this antique key that she would use to open this and sort of be like, I'm going to show you these things. And just the feeling of thrill to touch and see and take in these little objects that just felt fairy-like. And that experience repeated. It was something we would do often with the same objects. And there was just, a deep sense of wonder connected to that experience. And similarly, my grandfather was very interested in mind puzzles and building things, and there was an interest in learning how things worked. He was kind of a Renaissance man, fix-it guy, and could take anything apart and put it back together. And I think both of them, just from early on, instilled a deep sense of wonder. In California, there are sensory memories of the ocean. The ocean is really important to me. It's a place of joy and movement and just peace for me, of spiritual connection, political connection, and then also memories from Southern California of being in mustard fields, just the bright yellow that takes over the hillsides, which it's considered an invasive species, and we could get into the politics of that phrase and what that means. But through my whole life, that's been an intense visual experience of beauty, and sensory experience of the land that I would look forward to every winter and spring. So those are things that stand out.
I can relate so much. My mother collects some stones, and I think the most precious one she has is a star garnet. I've actually written so many poems about that star garnet. And my father also is a fixer-upper, so in comparison to your grandma and grandfather, my dad is a carpenter, and he's making all these kitchen renovations recently at home. My mother's so happy. But yeah,
amazing.
It's very interesting how we can connect to our family and especially our ancestors, either in the present or in the past. Moving on. As bedtime stories, my dad would tell me about his border crossings from Mexico to the United States, and he would frame them like pilgrimages. He also wrote me the most sappy love poems, and he sang me the worst renditions of Antonio Aguilar. So one time I wrote a short story for him as a present, in this tattered notebook that had a really beautiful gray elephant on the cover. And this was while we were in Mexico visiting my grandma for the first time. And when I handed it to him, he had spent the entire night translating it into Spanish. And then during breakfast, he read it to my whole family. And it just made me so happy to feel that like sense of support and communion with my family. It totally put me on a trajectory to becoming a writer. And so in your case, who or what introduced you to writing? Where does your story as a writer begin, and what made you decide, I'm going to be a poet?
I love that story about your family, too. That's a beautiful act of solidarity from your father as well. I don't feel like I ever decided to be a poet. I think that the identity of being a writer felt intrinsic to me from early childhood for some reason, some unexplained reason. I mean, I think my mom was amazing about reading to me and my siblings every night before bed, and that was a practice that instilled for me a deep love of books. But even as an infant, before I could walk, like I was just given books to hold and relate to and read in whatever sense a baby can read a book, and the love of books has just felt so strong for me, always. And there's a home video of me at about 7 years old where my father is asking me and my siblings each, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I just very emphatically am like, I will be a writer. And there was just, it's fascinating to me to look back on that and wonder, like, why was that such a strong knowing in my little 7-year-old self? So yeah, that just felt present for me. And then in the 3rd grade, I had was given the gift of a teacher doing a poetry lesson and introducing me and my peers to the form of poetry, to the craft of poetry, through like 3rd grade level readings. I was a huge Shel Silverstein fan at that age. But I just remember a sense of like wonder and magic and the power of words, even at that age. Feeling like, yeah, there was just a sense that crafting with words on the page was a kind of creative, generative process that I could put something into the world. Like, that felt magical at the time. Yeah, and then I just wrote so many poems from that age forward and didn't really know what I was doing. It was a lot of mimicry of other writers, and I think the older I got, the sense of poetry as a political medium also became really evident, and that it just felt like a really important way to be expressing views, questions, stories about the world and to the world that could potentially, like, maybe not change the world overnight, but might change something about how somebody sees something. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I think that's a piece of like what has always kept me relating to poetry as a form.
It's so interesting how 3rd grade can be such a turning point in like a childhood's life, especially because after you said that, I was like, wait a minute, Miss Leach, 3rd grade, she gave me a book of 101 short poems, and I thought it was stupid, but that was her gift for me because I think she saw something in me. I remember she said, there's even a little note like, Karla, I think this is going to be good for you. And I actually still have that book.
That's really
My mother
sweet.
Was actually pulling it out recently, so.
Yeah,
it's just so interesting. Especially
yeah, shout out to Mrs. Galligan.
Okay, now this is a little personal, but I was introduced to your work when I was an undergraduate student in my first poetry workshop, alongside poetry of Araceli Gourmet and Eduardo C. Corral and Natalie Center-Zapico. And through all 3 of these poets, they've shaped my poetic aesthetic and how I kind of view and interact with poetry. And your poetry collection, The Inheritance of Haunting, is what ultimately inspired me to write a poetry collection that traces colonial history and migration through my own family's perspective, attempting to speak from the past to the present and beyond into the future. And so tell us about the School of Heidi. What poets were influential for your development as a writer?
I think early on, growing up in suburbia in Southern California, I didn't, and also it was pre-internet days, I just would go to like Barnes and Noble or whatever big box bookstore that I had access to, and find whatever was on their shelves, like always to the poetry section, but somehow I ended up reading and rereading a lot of Pablo Neruda, partly because my parents also, like my father had majored in Spanish and my mom had, has a lifetime relating to Spanish literature, and Neruda was a book that was on our family bookshelf. And then I also was introduced to Arthur Rimbaud early on, and it was kind of I remember being kind of obsessed with the two of them during my teen years, and just reading and rereading a lot of their work, and like emulating and working with and experimenting with what they were doing. Edna St. Vincent Millay was somebody whose work was gifted to me when I was in the process of coming out as queer, and her as a poet who queers claim as a queer ancestor. It was kind of a mix. And then I think through the process of working on The Inheritance of Haunting, and after was really when I started to dive into more contemporary writers with a different kind of intention and hunger for like better understanding who was out there now, and what writing I differently had access to. I didn't go through an MFA, so I didn't really have a kind of mentorship to even like guide me through like, here's who you should be reading, and here's who's really influencing the public through their work. And that's been a process of learning, who's out there and who do I feel kindred to. And I think all the books of Araceli Esquirmay have been really important to me. Different poets who are doing a lot of social documentary experiments with their own writing and archival work. I love like Claire Muishka's Upend, Mai Dervong's Yellow Rain, like books like that are integrating social documentation and personal history, personal narrative with the poetic form. Have also taught me a lot about how to tell a story with what's present and absent in the archive, what we remember and can't remember. Those are some examples.
All beautiful examples. I remember reading Upend and being like, this is what I want to do.
Yeah, I love that book.
I do too.
It's such a brilliant book.
Now I'm going to get a little heavy here. For our listeners, tell us, what does poetry mean to you? As a poet who didn't take the traditional route of an MFA program, how did you find your poetic community? Which I think you kind of answered in a way, but maybe you have some further insight as well. And how have you sustained yourself in the pursuit of the craft, like spiritually, emotionally?
I might need you to repeat each of those. I'll try to answer each of those questions. But what does poetry mean to me? I think I really think about poetry as a way of life, and part of what I kind of insist on with my own students is that whether or not you've ever written a poem, if you are attuned to beauty, if you are attuned to feeling, if you are attuned to history, to just the world around you, the sensory experience, the relationships happening, then you are living in poetry in some way, and getting those experiences on the page is just one part of it, but not even necessarily required to be considered a poet in my book. I think it's really about a way of moving through the world, a way of relating to others, a way of seeing. So that feels true for me. It also feels like a kind of magic. I think the space between witchcraft and poetic craft is historically quite, they're approximate to each other, or informing each other. And there is a kind of material transmutation of experience and worlds that poetry is doing always. What was the second question in that list?
Let's see, how you sustain yourself in your pursuit of the craft, emotionally, spiritually.
Always reading others, just feeling nourished by language and words done well, and other poets' willingness to experiment, to take risks in their own writing. But then also, I spend a lot of time in nature and with music and with these other kinds of sensory experiences that are sort of always feeding into my poetic brain. But I think that it wouldn't, without reading others, whether it's reading other poetry or philosophy, or I love reading various kinds of critical theory and nonfiction. It's always bringing new questions into my life, new ways of seeing. That feels like a really important part of the practice.
As a Ph.D. student, that resonates with me so much, because I'm also a poet, and so everything that I'm learning in my classroom during my coursework, it's popping up in my poetry, and I really do feel that when I read your poetry. It's really moving.
Thank you.
Lastly, not only do you identify as queer and non-binary, but as Sikh, disabled, a second-generation brown Colombian, and alongside your roles of poet, scholar, and educator, you even consider yourself a cultural worker. How do your life experiences and struggles inform your poetics or shape your poetic house?
I definitely grew up feeling very strange in the world, and I think writing has always been a way to reach for others, to connect with others, and to be in solidarity with others who feel strange in the world, against the status quo, whether it's people of color, queers, sick and disabled people, anybody who has been historically marginalized, just wanting to be another voice in the world that those people can find and say to themselves, oh, I'm not alone in this. Because so much of reading other people's work has been that gift for me. And that's also about survival. It's about finding new ways to thrive in seeing how other people are moving through the world. So feeling like that's kind of at the center of what a lot of those life experiences have led me to in terms of what I want my own work to be doing. Also, all of those pieces of my life maybe have made different kinds of anti-colonial and decolonial theory and arts just really vital in terms of global networks of solidarity, historical networks of solidarity, to I love reading Aimé Césaire and discourse on colonialism, and just this ferocious and acute and poetic relationship to decolonizing. And even though he lived in another period and no longer is with us on this planet, somebody like him, I still feel is kin and community and a contemporary in a different way. But I guess, yeah, there's always that kind of anti-colonial impulse in me, coming from those different experiences and driving the work that I do.
I think your response is such a perfect segue into part two that I've kind of
Great.
conducted for the interview, looking at erasure and recognition that's happening within your poetry.
Mm-hmm.
So looking back on the inheritance of haunting, you emphasize the global history and traumas that we carry in our bodies. You invoke the personal and the archival ancestors whose voices emit stories of intergenerational trauma and violence. How did this project develop? I had read somewhere that you had originally planned for this to be a chapbook too. I'd love to see how it developed into the poetry collection that we know today. And lastly, how do you see this collection informing the current global traumas and lineages that we are experiencing in the present?
Yeah, to respond to the first part of that question, in 2010, sort of hit rock bottom of a long journey of chronic illness and trying to figure out what was going on with my health. But I had between 2012 and 2015, I had a 3-year period where I was really bedbound and unable to work for, I don't know, maybe 70 to 80% of the time. And at the same time, I was starting an ancestral kind of documentation project with my godmother, who's my aunt. Really diving into family archives, family photos, but also using genealogical research and just trying to kind of map out who our people were, where they came from. And I think the combination of those two things, as well as reading the work of Aurora Levins Morales, who's an amazing queer, disabled, Jewish, Puerto Rican poet, activist, healer, writer. Her work really helped me understand that illness is always a political and historical experience, and that our bodies are inheriting multiple generations of both trauma and these histories of political violence, as well as histories of resistance and resilience and capacity. But that really took me on this journey of feeling like if I couldn't be participating in the world in ways that are more dominantly understood as political, what was the work that I could be doing from bed. And that sort of led to a lot of the research that became the poems that became the inheritance of haunting. Yeah, it felt like a way for me to survive what I was going through and to also connect to the larger world around me through that physical isolation. It was a chapbook at some point. That was partly because a press invited me to submit it as that, and then because of what was going on with the life of the press, it was going to take a lot longer than I think I wanted to wait for, and the Andrés Montoya Poetry Prize submission period came up, and I had enough for a whole manuscript, so I put that together, and here we are. And there was a third part of the question. What was?
How do you see this collection informing the global traumas and lineages that are occurring in the present? Because I know you refer to the Congo and to Palestine, and I just feel like those conversations are so relevant right now in the contemporary.
Yeah, even though at this point some of these poems are almost 10 years old, it's not a very long time, but I was doing human rights research for several years in different militarized regions, And that was informing a lot of what research in poetry also looked like and the stories I wanted to tell. So yeah, I was working on issues in El Salvador, in Colombia. I was supporting someone else doing research on violence against U.S. veterans as well as Iraqi people in terms of U.S. occupation. There were just all these different contexts that were intersecting with my life and sort of informing my sense of what was happening in the world and the entanglement of all of these places and U.S. imperialism. And I think that a lot of it remains relevant. We're many months into genocide in Palestine, genocide happening in the Congo, despite the rhetoric of the Colombian government about what peacetime looks like, people are still being killed for their land and disappeared. And so not a lot has changed in terms of like the global the environment of violence that we're facing. It's mutating, I think, as technology changes, as governments shift, but it still feels relevant. And yeah.
I really enjoyed reading The Inheritance of Haunting. I had never read a work that had like so many voices and so many perspectives and outlooks on like global traumas and histories. And I feel like it kind of carries over into your chapbook Ephemeral. While reading Ephemeral, I thought about queer futurity in the midst of epidemics and pandemics, and the exiled body as a vessel of memory and trauma, and this need for evidence of gay and queer experiences, especially as protest and activism in the midst of rising political tensions and controversies, the significance about queer indestructibility, but also queer vulnerability, which I feel like is just so present in Ephemeral. And I think you even quote Cruising Utopia in the very beginning, and it made me think about these queer migrations and how you elicit this transformation and this longing to be a bird and to migrate. Who or what was the inspiration behind this chapbook, and what did you learn while writing it?
Most of the poems in Ephemeral came out through the early couple years of the pandemic, and I was, I think also when The Inheritance of Haunting came out, it was published kind of at a moment where I was feeling a lot more comfortable just being out as queer publicly, and then it's been a longer time, maybe in the last few years, of being more out and vocal about illness and disability. And so Ephemeral is kind of like carrying a lot of those shifts in my own life and the importance that I feel in showing up under those different identities, not as concrete, static things, but as a way to articulate a particular experience in the world, a way to articulate structural issues, systemic issues that I want other people to be able to see and feel less alone in the world for. So yeah, Ephemeral has been more of a way to like articulate those pieces of my experience as an experiment. And I think also the idea of ephemerality, both in terms of the queer evidence that Munoz is, that idea of ephemerality, of queerness as an ephemeral thing, felt really relevant also in the experience of the pandemic and just what it is to be a body in this world, in this lifetime. What was the second part of your question?
just who or what was the inspiration behind it, but what did you learn while writing?
What did I learn? Oh, I feel like it was also maybe the beginning of more experimentation with form on the page and thinking more deeply about craft and seeking out other contexts where I could be learning about craft and trying new things. I hadn't really taken poetry workshops in writing The Inheritance of Haunting, at least since high school classes, like English classes, but...
Which is so shocking because your poetry's there. It's so beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah, so it's really been like since then that I've sought out different workshops and just opportunities to learn and expand my craft in different ways. So I think ephemeral is also showing some of that, or it's a space of play in a different way.
And how do you feel now that ephemeral is published and it's out in the world? I know you said that you want your poetry in some way or another to become like this powerful force that can like change people's perceptions. What do you think ephemeral is doing when a reader picks it up for the first time?
I think what has been most moving to me is getting it into the hands of younger queers. I was gonna say queer youth, but but just I think mostly of younger people who have reached out to say like what it has meant to them and to feel just the ways that our writing can have impact, can help someone else feel seen. And yeah, that's maybe been the feeling of like, oh, something I wrote could do that for somebody is such a beautiful thing and is an amazing reminder of why we write. Yeah, that stands out to me the most.
In the fact that The Inheritance of Haunting and ephemeral will look at ancestral and queer recognition and invisibility, and I hope this isn't putting you on the spot, but I would love for you to share one poem from The Inheritance of Haunting and one poem from ephemeral. And then if you could answer this question after reading it, how does your poetry collection and your chapbook speak to each other?
Good question. Was there a particular poem you were wanting me to read?
I would love to hear any poem. Like, what's a poem that you love in this poetry collection? Because I feel like we all have our little darlings, especially like where we're like we put them in that specific spot because we feel like they'll be spotlighted. I would love to hear that poem.
I think my favorite poem, and I end up reading it often, maybe because I love, there's like an almost dreamlike experience that it takes me into, but If I Wear My Hair This Way, which I often preface by sharing that some of my ancestors were miners in Colombia, and some of my human rights research has also taken me to Afro-Colombian communities in the Southwest who have suffered intense paramilitary occupations because of multinational extractive mining. And so for me, connecting those two things has felt really important. And this poem is just kind of, it's feeling into the contrast between more extractive mining, where the body is also a resource for extraction and of labor, where there's alienation from ancestral modes of mining, and in contrast, the connection to ancestral mining that is more sustainable for land and body, and allows for the continued integration and maintenance of culture and relationship. So this is If I Wear My Hair This Way. Mija, If I wear my hair wrapped in a bun this way, like a cyclops full moon or the tidy nest of a colibri, it means the day was long in grave caverns. It means I spent the hours eating mud, scouring the under-earth for light and glimmer. It means my blistered feet will ache by the fire, and I will have no words for you tonight. Pero mija, if you see my hair let loose, suelto, unleashed, like a crown of wild spiral crows or a fishing net full of flying sable salmon, it means the hours passed while I panned in the shallow edges of a cool spring, gazing into the batea. It means your smile came to me, a glistening sun in the silver sifting plate. It means tonight I will knit my arms around you. I will open my ears to your monsoon of questions. I will sing you the holy songs of trees. And then to read a poem from Ephemeral. Maybe I'll read Sonnet for the Study of Earth and Dream State.
I love that one.
Which is after Andrés Montoya and integrates some imagery and language from the Ice Worker Sings. In the dream, even the poppies have eyes, their indigo pupils refusing slumber. And isn't the whole world a procession of watchful animacies, as mycelia conferencing with the birches, the raking pull of slaughtered histories? The muscle in my right leg accuses me. Limping, I am a contraction of debts, an agitation of separations. Moaning visions, these rivers undone. Planetary and capillary the wound. Field unto field, a registry of poisonings. I lean into a butterfly's short and storm-brewing life. The story and the sadness are the same. The sadness and the pain are the story. The story in pain twins the groaning earth its disastered wants. But there is more than what winds down from conquest. My brittle tooth stands guard, tending my tongue its poetry. The boulder mines the ravine. Awakens from the surreal nightmare of human estrangements. Metrics divorced from seasons, dams, extractions, and time counted small. The fig and the wasp and I, a strange sky staggering. We, the touch of lovers. Our hunger is profiting no one. The grasses sing, the ice sings, away, away, and then the sea, its ancient inventions bellowing something about a fool's paradise, erected brick by machine-made brick, her blue holler, an exiled frequency. I've never read those two poems together, but even I'm like thinking about how they speak to each other also. Yeah, I think the relationship between the two collections, underlying all of my work, scholarly and poetic, I think is always a question of the human and the construction of the human as a figure in Western liberal history and colonial history, but yeah, the question of who is allowed into the category of the human, whose lives are valued as human, whose aren't, who's considered disposable or ejected from the human, and what that means for the social, political, historical landscape that we share on this planet. So that feels like maybe the through line.
For me, your poetry, it invokes so much of these literary traditions. And I remember talking about this yesterday during the event, but these strange earth pillars, these invocations of becoming beasts or animals, these invocations of waters and migration, and these invocations of home grounds, whether they be emotional, sexual, physical. And I just feel like your poetry takes us into these invocations. And the sound transforms me. I feel like sound has such a transformative power, and when reading your work, I become the color purple. And it's so significant to me that purple is what I see when I look at the cover.
That's beautiful. I love that.
Well, what are you working on currently? And I know this might be a touchy topic, but we're interested. We want to know if there's any projects under the works right now, or if there's anything that you're thinking about moving towards.
As far as poetry goes, I just finished my second full-length manuscript, which actually has more themes of monstrosity and beastliness. So I'm working on finding a home for that. And then the third full-length collection is focused more on like neuroqueer, neurodivergent being and knowing. In the last couple of years, I've come to identify with neuroqueerness and have really been amazingly invited into different communities of neurodivergent poets. And that has been an amazing, just an opening into better understanding some of the ways my own brain and nervous system and self operate in the world, and a really deep kind of affirmation of different orientations to sensory experience, to subjectivity. So for the last few months, been editing and curating a column on neurodivergent and neuroqueer poetics, and then I'm beginning to work on a poetry collection that is exploring that, both in terms of topic but also methodologically, like if we're sort of just asking kind of what does it mean to for methods of writing to also be neurodivergent, and what then does that potentially look like on the page. So that's, stuff on the horizon, being explored.
I love it. I love all your work already.
Thank you.
But I'm loving this project of placemaking that you're doing. I'm really excited to see where it's going to go. So thank you. And last question for the interview. So sad, but I think this is a very important question. But what advice would you give to writers who are starting a book or considering a chapbook and want to kind of put themselves out there?
Put yourselves out there. I feel like I support, there are a few more emerging, newer poets who I try to support on a regular basis, and one of the biggest blocks is that fear of just sending your work out. One of the biggest blocks that I see people struggle with, and it's silly, but part of what I tell people is, like, I played soccer for 15 years growing up, and my coaches would say, statistically, for every one goal that you make as a team, you have to make at least 10 shots. So I kind of treat poetry submissions that way. It seems to play out, like, more or less across the years. Yeah, it played out that way. And it can feel like such a big risk to put our work out there, but I think I've learned to not invest rejection and acceptance with any, like, I don't really connect that to my sense of self or the value of my writing. And maybe that's something that has happened across time, but I try to encourage newer writers to disconnect those things, because part of what I think we don't see behind the scenes often is all the factors that go into any one acceptance that have nothing to do with who you are as a poet, have nothing to do with the writing. Like, in terms of the quality of the writing, it's just like, is this a fit for this place right now in this time? that doesn't mean that, like, if I get a piece rejected 5, 6, 7 times, then I'm like, okay, maybe there's some revision to happen here. But yeah, it feels more like a lottery a lot of the time, and that's just something I try to emphasize, so that maybe it's lowering the stakes of the sending work out and whatever result comes from that. Just trying to like demystify that process for people and like make it less scary feels important. But then also in terms of writing a book, it feels really important to just write what you need to write for yourself, to write what feels urgent in your body, in your being, not necessarily thinking about what will this be as a book that then could be in the world. Like, that comes later in terms of the sculpting of what you're writing, but I think it's really important at first to just, get on the page what needs to be on the page. And like I said in Paul's class yesterday too, thinking of each poem and of a book itself as their own being that maybe could be a little detached from the self, and what that then allows for in terms of asking, like, if we are stewards for this collection or this poem thriving and being the best version of itself, it can be, that maybe helps with like the killing of the so-called darlings. Yes. Through that process of curation of a work. Just to be writing what you need to be writing, and understand that putting one's work out into the world can potentially be life-saving to someone else. And then maybe that becomes less about, am I going to be rejected or not, and what does that mean for my ego? And more about, is there anyone out there who might need this, and am I willing to take the risk of that potential solidarity? Reframing it that way has helped me.
Your words are invoking for me, like, I'm imagining like these potential manuscripts and these potential poems within these submissions as like paper boats, or like little rolled up scrolls in a bottle that you're kind of casting out into the river or the sea, and hopefully you'll reach someone. That's such a mystical way of looking at it. I know, but like that's what I'm feeling from your.
Yeah, it feels like an often mystical process or experience.
Well, thank you so much for coming to South Bend and for doing this oral history interview with me. And thank you so much for reading these poems. I just think that this is going to be a very valuable piece of archival history.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much.